Chapters 17 through 20 of Human Bondage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 17. Philip passed the next 2 years with comfortable monotony. He was not bullied more than other boys of his size, and his deformity, withdrawing him from games, acquired for him an insignificance for which he was grateful. He spent a couple of terms with Winks in the upper third. Winks, with his weary manner and his drooping eyelids, looked infinitely bored. He did his duty, but he did it with an abstracted mind. He was kind, gentle, and foolish. He had a great belief in the honor of boys. He felt that the first thing to make them truthful was not to let it enter your head for a moment that it was possible for them to lie. "Ask much," he quoted, "and much shall be given to you." Life was easy in the upper third. You knew exactly what lines would come to your turn to construe, and with the crib that passed from hand to hand you could find out all you wanted in 2 minutes. You could hold a Latin grammar open on your knees while questions were passing round. And Winks never noticed anything odd in the fact that the same incredible mistake was to be found in a dozen different exercises. He had no great faith in examinations, for he noticed that boys never did so well in them as in form. It was disappointing, but not significant. In due course they were moved up, having learned little but a cheerful effrontery in the distortion of truth, which was possibly of greater service to them in after life than an ability to read Latin at sight. Then they fell into the hands of Tar. His name was Turner. He was the most vivacious of the old masters, a short man with an immense belly, a black beard turning now to gray, and a swarthy skin. In his clerical dress there was indeed something in him to suggest the tar barrel, and though on principle he gave 500 lines to any boy on whose lips he overheard his nickname, at dinner parties in the precincts he often made little jokes about it. He was the most worldly of the masters. He dined out more frequently than any of the others, and the society he kept was not so exclusively clerical. The boys looked upon him as rather a dog. He left off his clerical attire during the holidays, and had been seen in Switzerland in gay tweeds. He liked a bottle of wine and a good dinner, and having once been seen at the Café Royal with a lady who was very probably a near relation, was thenceforward supposed by generations of schoolboys to indulge in orgies, the circumstantial details of which pointed to an unbounded belief in human depravity. Mr. Turner reckoned that it took him a term to lick boys into shape after they had been in the upper third, and now and then he let fall a sly hint which showed that he knew perfectly what went on in his colleagues' form. He took it good-humoredly. He looked upon boys as young ruffians who were more apt to be truthful if it was quite certain a lie would be found out, whose sense of honor was peculiar to themselves and did not apply to dealings with masters, and who were least likely to be troublesome when they learned that it did not pay. He was proud of his form and as eager at 55 that it should do better in examinations than any of the others as he had been when he first came to the school. He had the choler of the obese, easily roused and as easily calmed, and his boys soon discovered that there was much kindliness beneath the invective with which he constantly assailed them. He had no patience with fools, but was willing to take much trouble with boys whom he suspected of concealing intelligence behind their willfulness. He was fond of inviting them to tea, and, though vowing they never got a look in with him at the cakes and muffins, for it was the fashion to believe that his corpulence pointed to a voracious appetite, and his voracious appetite to tapeworms, they accepted his invitations with real pleasure. Philip was now more comfortable, for space was so limited that there were only studies for boys in the upper school, and then he had lived in the great hall in which they all ate and in which the lower forms did preparation in a promiscuity which was vaguely distasteful to him. Now and then it made him restless to be with people, and he wanted urgently to be alone. He set out for solitary walks into the country. There was a little stream with pollards on both sides of it that ran through green fields, and it made him happy, he knew not why, to wander along its banks. When he was tired, he lay face downward on the grass and watched the eager scurrying of minnows and of tadpoles. It gave him a peculiar satisfaction to saunter round the precincts. On the green in the middle they practiced at nets in the summer, but during the rest of the year it was quiet. Boys used to wander around sometimes, arm in arm, or a studious fellow with abstracted gaze walked slowly, repeating to himself something he had to learn by heart. There was a colony of rooks in the great elms, and they filled the air with melancholy cries. Along one side lay the cathedral with its great central tower, and Philip, who knew as yet nothing of beauty, felt when he looked at it a troubling delight which he could not understand. When he had a study (it was a little square room looking on a slum and 4 boys shared it), he bought a photograph of that view of the cathedral and pinned it up over his desk. And he found himself taking a new interest in what he saw from the window of the 4th Form room. It looked on to old lawns, carefully tended, and fine trees with foliage dense and rich. It gave him an odd feeling in his heart, and he did not know if it was pain or pleasure. It was the first dawn of the aesthetic emotion. It accompanied other changes. His voice broke. It was no longer quite under his control, and queer sounds issued from his throat. Then he began to go to the classes which were held in the headmaster's study immediately after tea to prepare boys for confirmation. Philip's piety had not stood the test of time, and he had long since given up his nightly reading of the Bible. But now, under the influence of Mr. Perkins, with this new condition of the body which made him so restless, his old feelings revived, and he reproached himself bitterly for his backsliding. The fires of hell burned fiercely before his mind's eye. If he had died during that time when he was little better than an infidel, he would have been lost. He believed implicitly in pain everlasting. He believed in it much more than in eternal happiness, and he shuddered at the dangers he had run. Since the day on which Mr. Perkins had spoken kindly to him when he was smarting under the particular form of abuse which he could least bear, Philip had conceived for his headmaster a dog-like adoration. He racked his brains vainly for some way to please him. He treasured the smallest word of commendation which by chance fell from his lips. And when he came to the quiet little meetings in his house, he was prepared to surrender himself entirely. He kept his eyes fixed on Mr. Perkins' shining eyes, and sat with mouth half open, his head a little thrown forward so as to miss no word. The ordinariness of the surroundings made the matters they dealt with extraordinarily moving, and often the master, seized himself by the wonder of his subject, would push back the book in front of him, and with his hands clasped together over his heart, as though to still the beating, would talk of the mysteries of their religion. Sometimes Philip did not understand, but he did not want to understand. He felt vaguely that it was enough to feel. It seemed to him then that the headmaster with his black straggling hair and his pale face was like those prophets of Israel who feared not to take things to task. And when he thought of the Redeemer, he saw him only with the same dark eyes and those wan cheeks. Mr. Perkins took this part of his work with great seriousness. There was never here any of that flashing humor which made the other masters suspect him of flippancy. Finding time for everything in his busy day, he was able at certain intervals to take separately for a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes the boys whom he was preparing for confirmation. He wanted to make them feel that this was the first consciously serious step in their lives. He tried to grope into the depths of their souls. He wanted to instill in them his own vehement devotion. In Philip, notwithstanding his shyness, he felt the possibility of a passion equal to his own. The boy's temperament seemed to him essentially religious. One day he broke off suddenly from the subject on which he had been talking. "Have you thought at all what you're going to do when you grow up?" he asked. "My uncle wants me to be ordained," said Philip. "And you?" Philip looked away. He was ashamed to answer that he felt himself unworthy. I don't know any life that's so full of happiness as ours. I wish I could make you feel what a wonderful privilege it is. One can serve God in every walk, but we stand nearer to him. I don't want to influence you, but if you made up your mind, at once, you couldn't help feeling that joy and relief which never desert one again." Philip did not answer, but the headmaster read in his eyes that he realized already something of what he tried to indicate. "If you go on as you are now, you'll find yourself head of the school one of these days, and you ought to be pretty safe for a scholarship when you leave. Have you got anything of your own?" "My uncle says I shall have 100 a year when I'm 21. "You'll be rich. I had nothing." The headmaster hesitated a moment, and then, idly drawing lines with a pencil on the blotting paper in front of him, went on. "I'm afraid your choice of professions will be rather limited. You naturally can't go in for anything that required physical activity." Philip reddened to the roots of his hair, as he always did when any reference was made to his club foot. Mr. Perkins looked at him gravely. "I wonder if you're not oversensitive about your misfortune. Has it ever struck you to thank God for it?" Philip looked up quickly. His lips tightened. He remembered how for months, trusting in what they told him, he had implored God to heal him as he had healed the leper and made the blind to see. "As long as you accept it rebelliously, it can only cause you shame. But if you looked upon it as a cross that was given to you to bear only because your shoulders were strong enough to bear it, a sign of God's favor, then it would be a source of happiness to you instead of misery." He saw that the boy hated to discuss the matter, and he let it go. But Philip thought over all that the headmaster had said, and presently, his mind taken up entirely with the ceremony that was before him, a mystical rapture seized him. His spirit seemed to free itself from the bonds of the flesh, and he seemed to be living a new life. He aspired to perfection with all the passion that was in him. He wanted to surrender himself entirely to the service of God, and he made up his mind definitely that he would be ordained. When the great day arrived, his soul deeply moved by all the preparation, by the books he had studied, and above all the overwhelming influence of the Head, he could hardly contain himself for fear and joy. One thought had tormented him. He knew that he would have to walk alone through the chancel, and he dreaded showing his limp thus obviously not only to the whole school who were attending the service, but also to the strangers, people from the city or parents who had come to see their sons confirmed. But when the time came he felt suddenly that he could accept the humiliation joyfully, and as he limped up the chancel, very small and insignificant beneath the lofty vaulting of the cathedral, he offered consciously his deformity as a sacrifice to the God who loved him. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. But Philip could not live long in the rarefied air of the hilltops. What had happened to him when first he was seized by the religious emotion happened to him now. Because he felt so keenly the beauty of faith, because the desire for self-sacrifice burned in his heart with such a gem-like glow, his strength seemed inadequate to his ambition. He was tired out by the violence of his passion. His soul was filled on a sudden with a singular aridity. He began to forget the presence of God which had seemed so surrounding, and his religious exercises, still very punctually performed, grew merely formal. At first he blamed himself for this falling away, and the fear of hell-fire urged him to renewed vehemence. But the passion was dead, and gradually other interests distracted his thoughts. Philip had few friends. His habit of reading isolated him. It became such a need that after being in company for some time, he grew tired and restless. He was vain of the wider knowledge he had acquired from the perusal of so many books. His mind was alert, and he had not the skill to hide his contempt for his companions' stupidity. They complained that he was conceited, and since he excelled only in matters which to them were unimportant, they asked satirically what he had to be conceited about. He was developing a sense of humor, and found that he had a knack of saying bitter things which caught people on the raw. He said them because they amused him, hardly realizing how much they hurt, and was much offended when he found that his victims regarded him with active dislike. The humiliations he suffered when first he went to school had caused in him a shrinking from his fellows which he could never entirely overcome. He remained shy and silent. But though he did everything to alienate the sympathy of the other boys, he longed with all his heart for the popularity which to some was so easily accorded. These, from his distance, he admired extravagantly, and though he was inclined to be more sarcastic with them than with others, though he made little jokes at their expense, he would have given anything to change places with them. Indeed, he would gladly have changed places with the dullest boy in the school who was whole of limb. He took to a singular habit. He would imagine that he was some boy whom he had a particular fancy for. He would throw his soul, as it were, into the other's body, talk with his voice, and laugh with his heart. He would imagine himself doing all the things the other did. It was so vivid that he seemed for a moment really to be no longer himself. In this way he enjoyed many intervals of fantastic happiness. At the beginning of the Christmas term which followed on his confirmation, Philip found himself moved into another study. One of the boys who shared it was called Rose. He was in the same form as Philip, and Philip had always looked upon him with envious admiration. He was not good-looking, though his large hands and big bones suggested that he would be a tall man. He was clumsily made. But his eyes were charming, and when he laughed — he was constantly laughing — his face wrinkled all round them in a jolly way. He was neither clever nor stupid, but good enough at his work and better at games. He was a favourite with masters and boys, and he, in his turn, liked everyone. When Philip was put in the study he could not help seeing that the others, who had been together for 3 terms, welcomed him coldly. It made him nervous to feel himself an intruder, but he had learned to hide his feelings, and they found him quiet and unobtrusive. With Rose, because he was as little able as anyone else to resist his charm, Philip was even more than usually shy and abrupt, and whether on account of this, unconsciously bent upon exerting the fascination he knew was his only by the results, or whether from sheer kindness of heart, it was Rose who first took Philip into the circle. One day, quite suddenly, he asked Philip if he would walk to the football field with him. Philip flushed. "I can't walk fast enough for you," he said. "Rot. Come on." And just before they were setting out, some boy put his head in the study door and asked Rose to go with him. "I can't," he answered. "I've already promised Carey." "Don't bother about me," said Philip quickly. "I shan't mind." "Rot," said Rose. He looked at Philip with those good-natured eyes of his and laughed. Philip felt a curious tremor in his heart. In a little while, their friendship growing with boyish rapidity, the pair were inseparable. Other fellows wondered at the sudden intimacy, and Rose was asked what he saw in Philip. "Oh, I don't know," he answered. "He's not half a bad chap, really." Soon they grew accustomed to the two walking into chapel arm in arm, or strolling round the precincts in conversation. Wherever one was, the other could be found also, and, as though acknowledging his proprietorship, boys who wanted Rose would leave messages with Carey. Philip at first was reserved. He would not let himself yield entirely to the proud joy that filled him, but presently his distrust of the fates gave way before a wild happiness. He thought Rose the most wonderful fellow he had ever seen. His books were now insignificant. He could not bother about them when there was something infinitely more important to occupy him. Rose's friends used to come in to tea in the study sometimes, or sit about when there was nothing better to do. Rose liked a crowd and the chance of a rag, and they found that Philip was quite a decent fellow. Philip was happy. When the last day of the term came, he and Rose arranged by which train they should come back, so that they might meet at the station and have tea in the town before returning to school. Philip went home with a heavy heart. He thought of Rose all through the holidays, and his fancy was active with the things they would do together next term. He was bored at the vicarage, and when on the last day his uncle put him the usual question in the usual facetious tone, "Well, are you glad to be going back to school?" Philip answered joyfully, "Rather." In order to be sure of meeting Rose at the station he took an earlier train than he usually did, and he waited about the platform for an hour. When the train came in from Faversham, where he knew Rose had to change, he ran along it excitedly. But Rose was not there. He got a porter to tell him when another train was due, and he waited. But again he was disappointed, and he was cold and hungry, so he walked through side streets and slums by a short cut to the school. He found Rose in the study with his feet on the chimney-piece, talking 18 to the dozen with half a dozen boys who were sitting on whatever there was to sit on. He shook hands with Philip enthusiastically, but Philip's face fell, for he realized that Rose had forgotten all about their appointment. "I say, why are you so late?" said Rose. "I thought you were never coming." "You were at the station at 4:30, said another boy. "I saw you when I came." Philip blushed a little. He did not want Rose to know that he had been such a fool as to wait for him. "I had to see about a friend of my people's," he invented readily. "I was asked to see her off." But his disappointment made him a little sulky. He sat in silence and when spoken to, answered in monosyllables. He was making up his mind to have it out with Rose when they were alone. But when the others had gone, Rose at once came over and sat on the arm of the chair in which Philip was lounging. "I say, I'm jolly glad we're in the same study this term. Ripping, isn't it?" He seemed so genuinely pleased to see Philip that Philip's annoyance vanished. They began as if they had not been separated for 5 minutes to talk eagerly of the thousand things that interested them. Chapter 19. At first Philip had been too grateful for Rose's friendship to make any demands on him. He took things as they came and enjoyed life. But presently he began to resent Rose's universal amiability. He wanted a more exclusive attachment, and he claimed as a right what before he had accepted as a favor. He watched jealously Rose's companionship with others, and though he knew it was unreasonable, could not help himself sometimes saying bitter things to him. If Rose spent an hour playing the fool in another study, Philip would receive him when he returned to his own with a sullen frown. He would sulk for a day, and he suffered more because Rose either did not notice his ill humor or deliberately ignored it. Not seldom Philip, knowing all the time how stupid he was, would force a quarrel, and they would not speak to one another for a couple of days. But Philip could not bear to be angry with him long, and even when convinced that he was in the right, would apologize humbly. Then for a week they would be as great friends as ever. But the best was over, and Philip could see that Rose often walked with him merely from old habit or from fear of his anger. They had not so much to say to one another as at first, and Rose was often bored. Philip felt that his lameness began to irritate him. Towards the end of the term 2 or 3 boys caught scarlet fever, and there was much talk of sending them all home in order to escape an epidemic. But the sufferers were isolated, and since no more were attacked, it was supposed that the outbreak was stopped. One of the stricken was Philip. He remained in hospital through the Easter holidays, and at the beginning of the summer term was sent home to the vicarage to get a little fresh air. The vicar, notwithstanding medical assurance that the boy was no longer infectious, received him with suspicion. He thought it very inconsiderate of the doctor to suggest that his nephew's convalescence should be spent by the seaside, and consented to have him in the house only because there was nowhere else he could go. Philip went back to school at half-term. He had forgotten the quarrels he had had with Rose, but remembered only that he was his greatest friend. He knew that he had been silly. He made up his mind to be more reasonable. During his illness Rose had sent him in a couple of little notes, and he had ended each with the words, "Hurry up and come back." Philip thought Rose must be looking forward as much to his return as he was himself to seeing Rose. He found that, owing to the death from scarlet fever of one of the boys in the 6th, there had been some shifting in the studies, and Rose was no longer in his. It was a bitter disappointment. But as soon as he arrived he burst into Rose's study. Rose was sitting at his desk working with a boy called Hunter, and turned round crossly as Philip came in. "Who the devil's that?" he cried, and then, seeing Philip, "Oh, it's you." Philip stopped in embarrassment. "I thought I'd come by and see how you were. We were just working." Hunter broke into the conversation. "When did you get back?" "5 minutes ago." They sat and looked at him as though he was disturbing them. They evidently expected him to go quickly. Philip reddened. "I'll be off. You might look in when you're done," he said to Rose. "All right." Philip closed the door behind him and limped back to his own study. He felt frightfully hurt. Rose, far from seeming glad to see him, had looked almost put out. They might never have been more than acquaintances. Though he waited in his study, not leaving it for a moment just in case then Rose should come, his friend never appeared. And next morning when he went in to prayers he saw Rose and Hunter singing along arm in arm. What he could not see for himself others told him. He had forgotten that 3 months is a long time in a schoolboy's life, and though he had passed them in solitude, Rose had lived in the world. Hunter had stepped into the vacant place. Philip found that Rose was quietly avoiding him, but he was not the boy to accept a situation without putting it into words. He waited till he was sure Rose was alone in his study and went in. "May I come in?" he asked. Rose looked at him with an embarrassment that made him angry with Philip. "Yes, if you want to." "It's very kind of you," said Philip sarcastically. "What do you want?" "I say, why have you been so rotten since I came back?" "Oh, don't be an ass," said Rose. "I don't know what you see in Hunter." "That's my business." Philip looked down. He could not bring himself to say what was in his heart. He was afraid of humiliating himself. Rose got up. "I've got to go to the gym," he said. When he was at the door, Philip forced himself to speak. "I say, Rose, don't be a perfect beast." "Oh, go to hell." Rose slammed the door behind him and left Philip alone. Philip shivered with rage. He went back to his study and turned the conversation over in his mind. He hated Rose now. He wanted to hurt him. He thought of biting things he might have said to him. He brooded over the end to their friendship and fancied that others were talking of it. In his sensitiveness he saw sneers and wonderings in other fellows' manner when they were not bothering their heads with him at all. He imagined to himself what they were saying. After all, it wasn't likely to last long. I wonder he ever stuck Carey at all. Blighter. To show his indifference he struck up a violent friendship with a boy called Sharp, whom he hated and despised. He was a London boy with a loutish air, a heavy fellow with the beginnings of a moustache on his lip and bushy eyebrows that joined one another across the bridge of his nose. He had soft hands and manners too suave for his ears. He spoke with a suspicion of a Cockney accent. He was one of those boys who are too slack to play games, and he exercised great ingenuity in making excuses to avoid such as were compulsory. He was regarded by boys and masters with a vague dislike, and it was from arrogance that Philip now sought his society. Sharp, in a couple of terms, was going to Germany for a year. He hated school, which he looked upon as an indignity to be endured till he was old enough to go out into the world. London was all he cared for, and he had many stories to tell of his doings there during the holidays. From his conversation — he spoke in a soft, deep-toned voice — there emerged the vague rumour of the London streets by night. Philip listened to him at once fascinated and repelled. With his vivid fancy he seemed to see the surging throng round the pit door of theatres, and the glitter of cheap restaurants, bars where men, half drunk, sat on high stools talking with barmaids, and under the street lamps the mysterious passing of dark crowds bent upon pleasure. Sharp lent him cheap novels from Hollywood Row, which Philip read in his cubicle with a sort of wonderful fear. Once Rose tried to effect a reconciliation. He was a good-natured fellow who did not like having enemies. "I say, Carey, why are you being such a silly ass? It doesn't do you any good cutting me and all that." "I don't know what you mean," answered Philip. "Well, I don't see why you shouldn't talk." "You bore me," said Philip. "Please yourself." Rose shrugged his shoulders and left him. Philip was very white, as he always became when he was moved, and his heart beat violently. When Rose went away he felt suddenly sick with misery. He did not know why he had answered in that fashion. He would have given anything to be friends with Rose. He hated to have quarrelled with him, and now that he saw he had given him pain, he was very sorry. But at the moment he had not been master of himself. It seemed that some devil had seized him, forcing him to say bitter things against his will, even though at the time he wanted to shake hands with Rose and meet him more than half-way. The desire to wound had been too strong for him. He had wanted to revenge himself for the pain and the humiliation he had endured. It was pride. It was folly, too, for he knew that Rose would not care at all, while he would suffer bitterly. The thought came to him that he would go to Rose and say, I'm sorry I was such a beast. I couldn't help it. Let's make it up. But he knew he would never be able to do it. He was afraid that Rose would sneer at him. He was angry with himself, and when Sharp came in a little while afterwards, he seized upon the first opportunity to quarrel with him. Philip had a fiendish instinct for discovering other people's raw spots, and was able to say things that rankled because they were true. But Sharp had the last word. "I heard Rose talking about you to Mellor just now," he said. "Mellor said, 'Why didn't you kick him? It would teach him manners.' And Rose said, 'I didn't like to.' Damn cripple." Philip suddenly became scarlet. He could not answer, for there was a lump in his throat that almost choked him. Chapter 20. Philip was moved into the sixth, but he hated school now with all his heart, and having lost his ambition, cared nothing whether he did ill or well. He awoke in the morning with a sinking heart because he must go through another day of drudgery. He was tired of having to do things because he was told, and the restrictions irked him, not because they were unreasonable, but because they were restrictions. He yearned for freedom. He was weary of repeating things that he knew already, and of the hammering away, for the sake of a thick-witted fellow, at something that he understood from the beginning. With Mr. Perkins you could work or not as you chose. He was at once eager and abstracted. The sixth form room was in a part of the old abbey which had been restored, and it had a Gothic window. Philip tried to cheat his boredom by drawing this over and over again, and sometimes out of his head he drew the great tower of the cathedral or the gateway that led into the precincts. He had a knack for drawing. Aunt Louisa during her youth had painted in water-colors, and she had several albums filled with sketches of churches, old bridges, and picturesque cottages. They were often shown at the vicarage tea-parties. She had once given Philip a paint-box as a Christmas present, and he had started by copying her pictures. He copied them better than anyone could have expected, and presently he did little pictures of his own. Mrs. Carey encouraged him. It was a good way to keep him out of mischief, and later on his sketches would be useful for bazaars. 2 or 3 of them had been framed and hung in his bedroom. But one day at the end of the morning's work, Mr. Perkins stopped him as he was lounging out of the form room. "I want to speak to you, Carey." Philip waited. Mr. Perkins ran his lean fingers through his beard and looked at Philip. He seemed to be thinking over what he wanted to say. "What's the matter with you, Carey?" he said abruptly. Philip, flushing, looked at him quickly. But knowing him well by now, without answering, he waited for him to go on. "I've been dissatisfied with you lately. You've been slack and inattentive. You seem to take no interest in your work. It's been slovenly and bad." "I'm very sorry, sir," said Philip. "Is that all you have to say for yourself?" Philip looked down sulkily. How could he answer that he was bored to death? "You know, this term you'll go down instead of up. I shan't give you a very good report." Philip wondered what he would say if he knew how the report was treated. It arrived at breakfast. Mr. Carey glanced at it indifferently and passed it over to Philip. "There's your report. You better see what it says," he remarked, as he ran his fingers through the wrapper of a catalogue of second-hand books. Philip read it. "Is it good?" asked Aunt Louisa. "Not so good as I deserve," answered Philip with a smile, giving it to her. "I'll read it afterwards when I've got my spectacles," she said. But after breakfast Mary Ann came in to say the butcher was there, and she generally forgot. Mr. Perkins went on. "I'm disappointed with you, and I can't understand. I know you can do things if you want to, but you don't seem to want to any more. I was going to make you a monitor next term, but I think I'd better wait a bit." Philip flushed. He did not like the thought of being passed over. He tightened his lips. "And there's something else. You must begin thinking of your scholarship now. You won't get anything unless you start working very seriously." Philip was irritated by the lecture. He was angry with the headmaster and angry with himself. "I don't think I'm going up to Oxford," he said. "Why not? I thought your idea was to be ordained." "I've changed my mind." "Why?" Philip did not answer. Mr. Perkins, holding himself oddly as he always did, like a figure in one of Perugino's pictures, drew his fingers thoughtfully through his beard. He looked at Philip as though he were trying to understand, and then abruptly told him he might go. Apparently he was not satisfied, for one evening, a week later, when Philip had to go into his study with some papers, he resumed the conversation. But this time he adopted a different method. He spoke to Philip not as a schoolmaster with a boy, but as one human being with another. He did not seem to care now that Philip's work was poor, that he ran small chance against keen rivals of carrying off the scholarship necessary for him to go to Oxford. The important matter was his changed intention about his life afterwards. Mr. Perkins set himself to revive his eagerness to be ordained. With infinite skill he worked on his feelings, and this was easier since he was himself genuinely moved. Philip's change of mind caused him bitter distress, and he really thought he was throwing away his chance of happiness in life for he knew not what. His voice was very persuasive, and Philip, easily moved by the emotion of others, very emotional himself notwithstanding a placid exterior, his face, partly by nature but also from the habit of all these years at school, seldom except by his quick flushing showed what he felt. Philip was deeply touched by what the master said. He was very grateful to him for the interest he showed, and he was conscience-stricken by the grief which he felt his behaviour caused him. It was subtly flattering to know that with the whole school to think about Mr. Perkins should trouble with him, but at the same time something else in him, like another person standing at his elbow, clung desperately to two words: "I won't, I won't, I won't." He felt himself slipping. He was powerless against the weakness that seemed to well up in him. It was like the water that rises up in an empty bottle held over a full basin, and he set his teeth, saying the words over and over to himself: "I won't, I won't, I won't." At last Mr. Perkins put his hand on Philip's shoulder. "I don't want to influence you," he said. "You must decide for yourself. Pray to Almighty God for help and guidance." When Philip came out of the headmaster's house there was a light rain falling. He went under the archway that led to the precincts. There was not a soul there, and the rooks were silent in the elms. He walked round slowly. He felt hot, and the rain did him good. He thought over all that Mr. Perkins had said, calmly now that he was withdrawn from the fervour of his personality, and he was thankful he had not given way. In the darkness he could but vaguely see the great mass of the cathedral. He hated it now because of the irksomeness of the long services which he was forced to attend. The anthem was interminable, and you had to stand drearily while it was being sung. You could not hear the droning sermon, and your body twitched because you had to sit still when you wanted to move about. Then Philip thought of the two services every Sunday at Blackstable. The church was bare and cold, and there was a smell all about one of pomade and starched clothes. The curate preached once, and his uncle preached once. As he grew up he had learned to know his uncle. Philip was downright and intolerant, and he could not understand that a man might sincerely say things as a clergyman which he had never acted up to as a man. The deception outraged him. His uncle was a weak and selfish man whose chief desire it was to be saved trouble. Mr. Perkins had spoken to him of the beauty of a life dedicated to the service of God. Philip knew what sort of lives the clergy led in the corner of East Anglia which was his home. There was the vicar of Whitestone, a parish a little way from Blackstable. He was a bachelor, and to give himself something to do had lately taken up farming. The local paper constantly reported the cases he had in the county court against this one and that, labourers he would not pay their wages to, or tradesmen whom he accused of cheating him. Scandal said he starved his cows, and there was much talk about some general action which should be taken against him. Then there was the Vicar of Ferne, a bearded, fine figure of a man. His wife had been forced to leave him because of his cruelty, and she had filled the neighbourhood with stories of his immorality. The Vicar of Searle, a tiny hamlet by the sea, was to be seen every evening in the public house a stone's throw from his vicarage, and the church wardens had been to Mr. Carey to ask his advice. There was not a soul for any of them to talk to except small farmers or fishermen. There were long winter evenings when the wind blew, whistling drearily through the leafless trees, and all around they saw nothing but the bare monotony of ploughed fields. And there was poverty, and there was lack of any work that seemed to matter. Every kink in their characters had free play. There was nothing to restrain them. They grew narrow and eccentric. Philip knew all this, but in his young intolerance he did not offer it as an excuse. He shivered at the thought of leading such a life. He wanted to get out into the world. End of chapter 20. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.